Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Season 2 of Leadership Jumpstart. I'm Anna Radcliffe. I'm the Director of Discipleship and Church Innovation for the RCA.
And I'm Billy Norden. I'm the Financial Education and Retirement Coordinator for the Board of Benefit Services of the RCA. Leadership Jumpstart is about helping you to get unstuck, not because we're the experts, but because we're in conversation with so many of our wonderful leaders in the RCA, and we get to walk with you as you navigate the real things in your congregational ministry settings.
So, Billy, today we're here to talk a little bit about the work that we have done through a grant-funded initiative by the Lilly Endowment called Thriving Congregations.
Thriving Congregations. It's a big deal in the Lilly Endowment circles. I've been able to observe the work that they've put in, and I've seen the Lilly Endowment invest in this particular initiative more so than so many others that they've rolled out over the years. So you've been hands-on with this. Why are they putting so much money, time, effort, and human resources into this?
Yeah, I think they're just as curious about what the modern congregation needs as we are. One of the things that we've heard over and over again through this program is that a thriving congregation, really the aim is to discover what's our mission and vision in the world today. How is God calling us to both be the hands and feet of Jesus, but also how to be really contextualized in the places where we've been planted? And so I run one of the programs that was kind of facilitated by Lilly. It's called Renovations here at the RCA. And I did not start the project, actually. I was blessed to receive the project in a very beautiful box that was handed off to me by some previous colleagues. But one of the things that we started off with was just registering, we don't want to be prescriptive about what a thriving congregation looks like. That's not something that we have capacity to do. That's not something that I think helps to say, like, this is what the beautiful packaged thriving church needs to look like.
Well, and I think mission and vision, it's so commonly used in church circles that there's almost a resistance to it. Like, okay, what are you about to sell me?
Totally.
Right? What prescribed program are you going to help me discover my mission and vision? So this, what you've discovered, is a different path.
Yeah, and even in church planting, my spouse and I planted a church. You start with this idea of mission and vision, and it's not necessarily like what's your mission and vision as the church planters. It's more of where have you been planted and what's happening in the community around you. And so when you start with that and start thinking through the context that you're located, that's really how you start to be continuously faithful to that mission and vision. And so that's what we've seen with congregations, is that some of them, there's one congregation that's participated with us, they're 175 years old. That's an old mission and vision. Yeah. And sometimes we stay connected to the way that those mission and vision words were set out in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we do what the Reformed people have always done. We're reformed and always reforming. So we're changing and flexing that mission and vision statement a little bit more.
Yeah, because a lot of people get stuck with mission and vision, and they think of it as this very permanent thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is that God calls us to different things in different seasons. And so we have to be adaptive, and it's going to be unique. So it's contextual,
right.
But there are probably also some set criteria that apply to most, if not all. And you're starting to discover those and live those out.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. So when I first came onto the project, there had been completed a listening session, and some of the RCA team had brought together a very dynamic group of ministry leaders, not necessarily all Reformed. And that diverse group sat down and asked the question, what is a thriving church? And they came up with a characteristic for kind of a church through the lens of 7 categories. And I'd love for us to just kind of name them and reflect on them. Before I say them, I feel like I need to make a caveat.
Okay.
These are not meant to be a diagnostic prescriptive lens. These are simply characteristics to help facilitate conversation, whether it's conversation for us in the denominational offices or in a congregation or amongst leaders. These characteristics, they can help us inform and start to see some of the areas of the church that we maybe haven't been very mindful of. And maybe some of the areas that we're super mindful of. And how can those things interact, and how do they create a really holistic ministry? That's the thought process behind this. I think sometimes it's easy to see a category list and think, oh, we're failing. We stink at everything.
Yeah, and well, especially if a word sticks out that you say like, oh, I don't like that, based on what I know of it. And sometimes we'll have to translate these into our context.
Yes, exactly. So the first one is practices and traditions. And I'm curious, how did you grow up taking communion as a kid?
Oh man, it was passing of the plates. Yeah. I think we would wait, to eat until it was commanded, and then maybe like if it was a good music Sunday, we would have like on Eagle's Wings like afterwards.
Oh yeah, vibing. Well, and we had that experience in classis meeting where there was several ministers that had come in from a different tradition, and we witnessed people taking communion, and some people held the elements and some people took the elements. And what we learned is that not everybody takes communion the same. Yeah. It depends on the church that you grew up in. It depends on the setting that you came from. My dad has a story. He went to Hope College, and the first time he took communion, they have the chalice and the bread, and he was the guy that took the bread, grabbed the cup, took a sip, and then immediately was mortified because he had drank from this communal cup. So practices and traditions is one of those categories for us that sometimes we don't even think about it. We don't think about the way we structure our worship services because it's just how we've always done it. And it isn't until we start to really ask, why are we doing the things that we do in the practice and the traditions of this worshiping body, that's when we start to really get to the meat of who we are as a church. Yeah,
and I love your example of that communion moment at the classis meeting, because as congregations start to try to thrive in a different way and they disrupt their practices, it's going to be messy. Like, it's going to be a little bit awkward because, again, it's acknowledging the reality that it's not always like it was. And we've got different people from different perspectives and cultural traditions coming together. And so it's going to take a little bit of uncomfortable figuring it out together.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think just one little piece is, as we have different generations coming into our worshiping spaces, which we've had since the beginning of the church, it takes some finesse because each generation has experienced their worshiping life differently, and we're creating spaces of worship that are meant to facilitate worship for all generations. So really thinking about our practices and traditions is an intergenerational conversation.
Okay, so that's point number one. What's number two?
Relationships, which you can kind of feel it as we tease that out. Relationships are really about, like, how are we with each other? How do we create a sense of community? Have you ever heard that idea of, like, a small church feels like a tight-knit family, and then a big church can feel more like a corporation?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Neither is bad or good, but being mindful of the ways that relationships are impacted by church size, for example. That's kind of what we're talking about with this category. How we facilitate hospitality, how we create spaces of equity, those are all involved in this relationship piece.
Yeah, because relationships, they can clearly help what we're trying to do, but they can also get in the way. They can be obstacles if we're not aware of how our current relationships function in the church.
Okay, I know you for sure have a story of a relationship time when you were pastoring or when you were a student growing up.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there was a situation in a congregation that I served where there was just a weird dynamic between some of our generational members. Like, there was clearly two different peer groups, and it took us about 2 or 3 years to figure it out, but there was a rift between two of them, two of the husbands, and that had become a decades-long problem that continued to sever the ability for these people to have Christmas parties together and all sorts of other things, and that was seeping into the life of the church and visitors coming in as well, because if they met one side first then the other, they wouldn't understand why they weren't connecting with this other side. And so we had to get to the root of that relational problem before we could start to learn how to integrate new folks into the life of the church.
And the way that when you interact with relationships, if you're not mindful of the ways that you are being authentic. For example, I'm not saying that you have to be super vulnerable, that you're sharing all your things. I feel like we've all had that like moment in churches where it's like, let's all share our prayers and concerns to the whole body.
Yes, or the person who just wears everything on their sleeve and they overshare 2 minutes before the service starts.
You're
and
like, okay.
That's a lot to hold at this moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go start the service now. Totally. I'm not saying that you have to do that, but I think there is a level of authenticity with relationships, especially when it relates, again, to this intergenerational thing. You have to be willing to know more than the person's name. I was talking with a church recently, and she was the wife of the music leader for the church, and she said, I have been here for 25 years, and nobody knew my name until about 5 years ago.
Oh.
It's those sort of levels where it's like, we have to, when we think about relationships, it has to go beyond just, I see you every Sunday. Creating authentic and belonging spaces that facilitate relationship is more intimate than just, hey, good to see you. Hope you had a good week.
We're so doing an episode on this, maybe even
two,
because
totally.
You think about too the strain of like how busy life is, and do I have the capacity to invest in others? Like those are all real questions that we need to honor for our people. This is in-depth stuff that affects the congregation, and I think we're all, I don't want to say guilty, but we're all we all have a role in how we show up and what we have to give in relationships. Okay, so what's number 3 beyond relationships?
Yes, so training. I was just talking about this with some leaders in the RCA. We don't train really for anything. Like, we don't know how to do it. We're like, oh, welcome to the consistory. Here's the meeting
But
now.
are we allowed to say that?
I hope so.
Yes, it's true. It's true.
We don't offer a lot of training when it comes to creating spaces for people who have not been a part of a routine or a part of the leadership body. And that's everything down from like how to pray all the way up to how do you lead a congregation? How do you develop a budget for a church? How do you interface with this bigger thing called General Synod? So the way that we are intentional about training is super key. And I'm going to give a plug to a podcast episode that we just did with our General Secretary, Eddie Aleman. He used to be the leader for leadership for the RCA, and he just shared this little tidbit on our podcast about the 70-30 rule. And he said 10% is reading a book. 10% of training is reading a book, going to a conference, some sort of tangible resource. Another 20% is walking alongside of that leader, bringing them into this role of coming alongside of me, asking curious questions. The other 70% is letting that person lead.
Ooh.
And
it feels right.
It feels right.
Yeah.
Because you need to have the ongoing kind of tweaks and shifts. And so we honor the fact that there needs to be some sort of like release. But you still hear there is a 30% of training. And so that is, I think, something that we're missing in our role as congregational leaders, is just asking that question and just taking a second to pause and say, how am I training my people beyond just, I trust that you know how to do your job.
Yeah.
There is a balance.
Yeah, and I heard a quote about organizational leadership that stuck with me, and I think it applies to ministry too. They said, if you want to know if you are a good leader or not, see how your organization is doing 5 years after you leave. And I think that speaks to that element of training, is who are we equipping and empowering to take up the work. And I know from like personal experience serving a congregation, the best case scenario is you've got a dynamic person who comes in and they do an amazing job with a program or an initiative, and we celebrate it, and then it goes until that person burns out and the rest of the volunteers burn out, and nobody is in place to sort of take it to the next step because we're not good at training.
Right.
So it's critical.
Right, yes, identifying those leaders and mobilizing them into those places, totally.
Yep, and it's a hard challenge because you're good at something doesn't mean that you know how to train somebody. So there's a layer above the person who's leading being able to train. We have to build it into our culture in a new way.
Yeah, it's like building a muscle, for sure. So the next category is justice. And it does kind of fit within some of this, because when we think about what's happening in our congregations, not just in the RCA, but in the U.S. overall, we're seeing aging demographics, and some of that is related to our kind of clunkiness around training younger leaders and bringing them into spaces of leadership. And that is a justice issue.
This one's so curious to me because I'm not used to seeing the word justice in line with, training, leadership, all of those classic buzzwords. So justice was a surprising one for me, but
Yeah.
I'm starting to get it, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a contextual one. So for each congregation, what we want to encourage is a sense of community, not just inside of the church, but outside of the church. Who are the people that God has entrusted to your care? Not just the people that come on Sunday mornings, but the people that live in the neighborhoods that are around you, the people that attend the local coffee shops, the people that go to the local bodega, whatever it is. So, whether it's engaging in your community in a way that is being familiar with the cares and concerns of the neighbor across the street, or maybe it's about asking curious questions to the people that work in the neighborhood. Justice isn't necessarily like the big buzz topics that we're used to. Justice is caring for the same concerns that the people that you live among, and being able to elevate them in such a way that it's kingdom oriented.
What's the underlying value with justice? I mean, obviously, all that stuff is really important, but why does that cause thriving?
Yeah, I think justice kind of gives this sense of togetherness. The stories that we've continued to hear, for example, are like where there's areas of food insecurity. One congregation, actually not in the RCA, this was through an entirely different program, they noticed that there was all of these shifting movements of grocery stores out of their community. They couldn't make financial ends meet, and so there was no food. It was a very sparse area, and the neighborhood was increasingly poor. And so they were like, we have all this land, let's turn this whole area into kind of vegetated community gardens. And what that did is it empowered the neighbors, it gave them a sense of ownership over the gardens, and it met a felt need. We need food to live.
Yes.
We need good food to live. And so that's kind of the spirit of justice.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing there too is it embodies faith.
Totally.
It's so often like theological, spiritual, out of body experience, but this says no, like your needs for food and water, your needs for people to be whole and healthy, it is all part of this.
Yes, and it is, again, like I think to just take justice apart from theology, which is another one of the characteristics, you don't have the full breadth of being the church. If you're apart, if justice is solely removed from theology, the motivation of loving your neighbor and serving your neighbor, it just isn't as hearty. And so that when we talk about theology, we're talking about how do we frame the way in which we understand who our neighbor is. When we think about theology, it's talking about how do we so love Christ in such a way that it overflows into the ways in which we get to know one another, that we're propelled into these intimate conversations and relationships. The way that we start to understand the gospel narratives, those are what inform us and actually instruct us in how to practically meet the needs of our neighbors.
So this is good. Like, what I'm sensing is that this is a pretty holistic thing, right? So we're not going to be able to pick and choose from these 7, that they're all pretty critical components to put together. Okay, so we've got justice, then number 5 is?
Well, we said theology, so I'm going to say we hit theology.
Okay.
The next one is leadership. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about leadership, again, it really is thinking about who are the people that we have within this faith community, and how are we tapping into their passions? How are we starting to understand them in such a way that it's not just, hey, we need you to serve in nursery because you have children, but instead, what are you passionate about? And how might you serve? Mm-hmm. What might you do to live into the life of this community together?
So how does that look different from like old school volunteering?
Yeah.
Because I mean, it sounds a lot like,
know.
all right, like let's live into your passions, but I think we're talking about something that's a little bit more in-depth, complex. What is it to you?
Yeah, so I think one of the grantees that we had that participated in this, he was a church planter and he had a hard time really trying to understand how to release, right? Like he was holding everything. And so his idea that he discerned with his coach was to go on sabbatical. And he was really targeting, you know, when he did his kind of assessment, his full gauge of what of these 7 characteristics fits within my ministry. Leadership was where he felt like he needed to grow, and that their church needed to grow. So when they went on sabbatical, it forced him to delegate and to hand leadership over to leaders. And so when he came back, they were like, we got it. We're running it. We're doing just fine. And he shared that with us. He said that was a really powerful lesson. Leadership is not just about giving away some of the responsibility and holding the weight of the other parts of the responsibility, but truly leadership is about empowering, releasing, empowering, releasing. It's not, again, back to that 30-70 rule. It's not just, I'm going to give you all the keys to the van and say, good luck, I hope you can drive well. It is truly, let's learn how to drive together. Let me show you how to kind of lead this hospitality team. And then I trust you. You've got this. And then the added level is that kind of additional piece of leadership is not just letting them keep the responsibility, but also empowering them to empower others. That's that last level that I think is often missed.
It's more communal. So when we're talking about leadership, we're not talking about a person doing a thing, but we're talking about some kind of a community effort.
Yes.
And one thing I heard in your story, which I'm starting to believe is critical, is there's a level of being uncomfortable or discomfort in good leadership.
Yeah.
Because I think about an old school version of leadership that was really more about like trying to lead so that everybody's comfortable. Like that was the idea of just making sure everything was stable and people were comfortable. Now this leader might say, you know, I'm here to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable, but I think that looked different than it does now, because I think leading well in a thriving congregation is going to take risk, and you're not going to come out unbruised from it.
Ouch. I think that's true. It stinks that that's true. But to kind of lean into some of the theology, I don't necessarily think we serve a comfortable God. And I really certainly don't think that Jesus showed us or led us in a way that was comfy.
Yeah, and it has growing in any form of the word ever been not without pain here and there, right? Like from just growing up to formation in school to getting good at your job, right? There are pain points, but like that's when we really grow and figure out who we are.
Yes. One last point about this that I just am thinking about. I think when it comes to leadership development, especially of young people, there is this present challenge. Organizations, churches that have been around for a long time, I often hear this expectation that's placed. I actually felt it working here. I'm going to be honest about this. When I first started working here, I was 24. And I definitely was one of the youngest on staff at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember the feeling of being so excited to go to a big girl job, but also feeling this kind of sense of fit the mold or get out. And I think when it comes to leadership development, especially of young leaders, when we are the ones training those young leaders, we need to also ask curious questions when they're pushing back against a systemic thing. For example, if it's like, why do we meet every week as a staff for 4 hours? Why do we do that? Because I can't get my work done. Why do we do that? As a leader, that feels threatening.
It does, because it's your way of being, and you have believed it, even if you haven't thought about it that much.
Yes. And I think the curious question becomes, why do we? And we pull out the pros and cons list and we start to weigh the options. But what tends to happen with young leaders and when we're developing these younger leaders is we say to them, here's the mold, fit within it, don't change it. This is how we need to live on, to survive. Sometimes our ways are really good and valid, but sometimes our ways could use some change. And I just think when it comes to leadership development, that is a piece of this category that it's not natural to us because it's not something culturally that we're taught to do.
Oh, we haven't been, that's not been modeled to us.
No.
Like, we don't have good models of what it is like to be a good, wise mentor, and to, rather than making people like us to like just form a firm foundation so that they can do their thing.
Yeah.
Like, and we can see the amazing things that flourish because of it.
Yeah. So the invitation is always, if you're a leader in a position of power, how can you slow yourself down to start asking curious questions? If someone comes to you and says they don't like something even, that is a leadership moment for you to ask a curious question. Why? Why don't you like this?
Urban Meyer says, don't get furious, get curious.
Yeah, okay, all right. That's enough.
That's enough. No more Urban
That's
Meyer
enough
quotes.
of
All
Urban Meyer.
right. All right, last one. So we're at the end of the line, number
Yes.
7.
Culture. So culture is not necessarily like, what's the culture of your church? Culture is what's happening in the world around you and how are you as the church called to respond? When we think about culture, this could be anything from what's the popular music, who are some artists that are involved in your community, is there some sort of like movement around restaurants, or is there kind of a particular event that happens in your community? Anything that sort of forms and shapes the space that you are involved in, that's part of your culture.
And do you notice that churches sometimes are ashamed or bashful, or they think that their culture isn't worthy of being their mission? I mean, I've got a friend in New Jersey, and their church had a hard time figuring out like what they should be about until they realized their culture was food. And I mean, a lot of churches gather around food, but they were really serious about it, doing progressive dinners and really gathering around that. And they were able to shift that into a missional approach where they were feeding people who needed food and doing all sorts of really good mission around that thing that they cared about and were good at. But they didn't initially feel like that culture was worthy of being the thing.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. I think there really is a sense of this cultural piece when we center that as who we are. It actually helps people more tangibly connect what it means to be a disciple. Another church that we know of, they were super passionate about their environment. It was a church of a lot of young people. They had a lot of fervor around climate change, and they decided to get invested in the local parks. And what that did for them was it created these spiritual routines where in the spring they start to think about, oh, it's going to be harvest season, or it's going to be planting season. And so then their whole kind of rhythm of the church centers around planting, harvesting, watering, and kind of stripping everything back. What that does then too is it creates a spiritual Sabbath, a spiritual rhythm of Sabbath that teaches silence and an appreciation for solitude. Those passions, those kind of things that really were not just a part of individuals, but a part of the cultural movement of their environment, has shaped who they are as a church. And I think there's a number of ways that other churches do this. When we were consulting with the Racial Ethnic Council, one of the leaders of CPAM, the Council of the Pacific Asian American Ministries, they said, we love food, just like you said. We want to gather around food. And we said, you should absolutely do that. There is a difference, though, when we talk about culture. There's I think an instinct to create spaces of accommodation and to pull back on some of the cultural pieces.
Yeah.
And that is not what we're suggesting with culture. Not necessarily what are the parts that we're afraid of losing? What are the pieces of our culture that we're having a hard time saying goodbye to. Just the last thing I'll say about this, a good friend of mine, he remembers when his church stopped speaking Dutch. And he remembers how hard that was for the older leaders in his church, because that was a part of their worshiping life. And so I hope you can see how connected practices and traditions are to culture. Sometimes for the whole body to be able to gather together, we have to put aside some things so that we can have a flourishing, thriving church.
Yeah, there's some things that matter, and there's some things that aren't necessarily an easy decision to let go of because they're not inherently bad, and they can be meaningful, but they still might be an obstacle.
Yeah, the curious questions, right? That's also a leadership characteristic.
All right, so we've got these 7 characteristics that can hopefully allow a congregation to thrive, right? Or at least to start the journey of thriving, which is what all of our congregations need. So season 2, we're going to dive into all sorts of these things. We're going to go specifically, and we're going to hear stories from our leaders out in the field doing really innovative work. So give us a little glimpse of what's coming up in season 2.
Yeah, I'm super excited. So we have one story following this that you'll get to hear from. That's kind of a response to this process. It's called Collaborative Ministries. 2 leaders that have been a part of a process through the Regional Synod of Albany. So we'll hear their story. We're also going to dive deeper into some of this next gen work. What does it mean to raise up leaders in an age when the church is going through some serious changes?
Yep. And we're also going to look at these through the lens of family systems and adaptive leadership, because as we get into the nitty-gritty details of each subject, we realize that it's going to push and pull and cause anxiety, and you as leaders deal with some really difficult stuff in the process. And so we just want to sit with those things, analyze them through that lens, and hopefully many of you will resonate with these stories.
Yeah. One last plug before we say goodbye. So if you're interested in these 7 characteristics, we are going to be launching a tool. It's an assessment tool that you can take. Anyone in your congregation can take this tool. The goal of it is to start these conversations. It is not meant to be a prescriptive tool. It's not meant to be a way to just blaze your pastor, but instead it's just meant to start a conversation. How can we as a church continue to live into our mission and vision, and what sort of things might we want to start addressing in our faith community?
Yeah, hopefully you'll be aware of all the resources that are available to you through the denominational offices.
Hey, thanks for joining us on this first episode of Season 2.
See you soon.
See you soon.